Hello and welcome. It's 2 o'clock or 2:02. You're watching What's Going On LaGuardia WLGR. I'm your host, Hugo Fernandez. And today my guest is very excited, Dr. Joni Schwartz, who is with the Humanities Communication Studies area, which if you didn't know, the radio station is managed by that area of the department. But she's going to talk about something special today, which is a journal that she's involved with out of the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. She's a co-editor. It's called Dialogues in Social Justice, an adult pedagogy journal. Did I get that right? I missed the last part. I almost did it perfect, Dr. Schwartz.
Adult Education Journal.
Thank you so much. An adult. I'll try to get that right for the end for the end credit. I just looked at it a little bit before the show. But before we get into that, I told Dr. Schwartz a little bit about my show, my format. I want to talk about her, certainly for a little bit. You want to tell us a little bit about yourself, like your background, your studies, and things you did before you came to LaGuardia?
Well, I did a lot of community organizing in the 70s and 80s in New York City when it was a very different place. I developed community-based organizations, homeless facilities, drug treatment programs. It was at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic when we began to address that issue, and then adult education as well. So mostly in Brooklyn. And so I come out of that community-based activist adult education background, then came to LaGuardia, which actually many of our students have that come from that same environment, and many of them come from a adult education background in terms of a GED and that kind of thing. But later I'll speak about adult education as a much broader term. But that's my background. Yeah.
Well, you missed the part about you're from Minnesota, right?
Originally, yes.
And what'd you study, Dr. Schwartz? What's your degree in?
Communications, speech communications. That's how I landed in the communications department. Yeah. Broadcasting and public speaking and group communication, that kind of thing. And I did some theater back in my undergraduate years also. And then I came to NYU and did my master's in communications also. Yep.
Is that where you got your doctorate as well?
No, Rutgers University, and that's what. And that after that, when I came back later in my life, to do my doctorate, and did that in adult education out of Rutgers. So yeah. The master's and the bachelor's is in communications, and the adult ed is the doctorate.
And before LaGuardia, you were with CUNY at City Tech. Is now, I used to call it Brooklyn Tech. And you want to talk about, was that where you were running a lot of these adult education programs?
No, I worked with the Black Male Initiative. I was a research coordinator with the BMI program. They called it the BMI program out of City Tech here. It's called BMAC. And so I was the research coordinator for that at City Tech, and also I did some adjunct teaching there. I worked with College Now. I also worked at Queenssborough for a time and taught communications there. So, yep.
And we've talked about the beach. It's the only CUNY with a beach. And a lot of people don't take advantage of it. So you've had a very diverse background, a lot of great things that you did. You want to talk a little bit about, coming to LaGuardia, why you came to LaGuardia, and as opposed to the work you were doing at City Tech?
Yep. Well, after I got my doctorate, I realized that I fell in love with research and writing, and that I didn't want to go back necessarily to community organizing and community centers and that kind of thing. I wanted to teach college, and LaGuardia was a perfect fit. It's a convergence of pretty much everything that I had done and the kind of students I had worked with. LaGuardia was a perfect fit. And I recognized the students at LaGuardia from the students that I had worked with for 20 years. And So I think that I had an advantage coming because I understood the context and the issues and the problems that many of them, and the challenges, let's say challenges that many of them came with. So it was a perfect fit for me. And uh, I've enjoyed being able to take what I had done all those years and to apply it in this setting. So it's a perfect match for me. And then going on with the work, which you maybe were going to ask about, with work with the prisons across the street, such as Queenssborough Correctional Facility, right across the street. Those students are the kinds of students I worked with also, those on probation and parole and coming back into the educational setting. So it was a perfect mix for me, and those are the kinds of students that I'm best with, and those are the kind of issues that I like to grapple with, and thus the convergence.
Of course, I've known you since you've come to the college in the humanities department, and I'm trying to remember if were you with us when we used to be in the E building. I don't. Did you?
Yes.
You were with us.
Yes.
So you've been with us
You
since then.
rode your skateboard down the hall. I remember. That's when I first.
You rode my skateboard, or I rode my skateboard?
No. Well, I may have rode yours too, but I remember you riding it down the hallway. That was my first introduction to who you are and how you traveled.
Scooter. Yes. Well, that was a very long walk. I had to walk all the way from the math department all the way over to where I forgot what that was, E201 or whatever the room was. And I know that Michael never gave me any grief, but Peter Katopis once caught me on it and was not particularly happy about it. I left that behind. So I had to leave it behind when we moved to the new location. But you did touch upon it. I've watched you do a lot of things. So the prison program is obviously something near and dear to your heart, and it's pretty exciting. And there's a lot of people involved now. But you've done a couple, the book and the film that came out, which I think was also part of some of the things you worked on when you were here, started working here at the college.
Yeah. Well, way back when people weren't talking about it, I did my dissertation on young men of color. And in my dissertation was on dropping out of high school. And basically what I came up with in my research, it wasn't the kids, it wasn't the young men, it was the system. And I think this was, in the very beginning, when people were just beginning to realize that, this is systemic racism, and that our educational system is set up for people to fail, especially young men of color. And it was when we were just getting into stop and frisk and all of that. And at any rate, I did a lot of work with young men of color and the issues around educational inequality and access and substandard opportunities in the public schools, and that in many ways that I would have dropped out of high school had I had to go to some of the schools that some of the guys did. So out of that came actually a first documentary called A New Normal, Young Men of Color, Trauma and Engagement in Learning. And that one can be found on YouTube. And it talks about the trauma, educational trauma, that the school system created for numbers of young men. And then after that, when I came to LaGuardia, there was a second documentary called Counter Stories After Incarceration. And that came out of a class at LaGuardia of a young student who I met who had just come out of prison, and his experiences coming to college. And so that talks about, involves the idea of coming back to college after you come from prison. And then that led to other writings, and I wrote with some of the students. And if you Google my writing, Joni Schwartz, you'll see some of those pieces and articles when talking a lot about young men of color and engagement in learning, a lot about after incarceration, And Way kind of led on to Way with all of that, and even to the work that I'm engaged in today.
It's what I've always found exciting about you and the work you do is that, here we have students who, are learning to write, learning to succeed. And obviously, some of our students start, behind the block, as you would say, or some people say sometimes like playing Monopoly, but everybody else has all of the real estate and the houses, and all you get is the money when you pass go that you immediately lose. But after working with you, they're walking out. These students are published. They've written their stories. They were like that. I remember when you did your book signing. I believe it was at City Tech at the time, or in the Brooklyn area. I think it was you had a relationship with a bank there, and I think we did it at the bank.
Oh, that was the book, Race, Education, and Reintegrating Formerly Incarcerated Citizens.
Right.
That I wrote with Professor. Yep.
Wrote with Professor.
John Chaney from the Criminal Justice Department.
Right. You both, but also some of the authors were some of your students.
Yes, it was an edited edition, and yes, students were authors in it. Yes.
And and so I was excited about that we were getting, these first person narratives of their own experience. And I was actually pretty impressed. I'm remembering the young man who was going on to study policy, and he was actually going to work on policy. I'm trying to remember his name, but I forgot.
Brian Miller.
So, and you had some history with me on the radio, because I think I brought him in. I don't know if you were part of that, or you basically said, no, talk to the students. And I ended up interviewing them for that show. And so that's always been impressive how you also do it with faculty. I know that you are a bit of a mentor for faculty and encouraging people with their writing, and which we'll talk about in the second half hour, which is really what the show is going to focus on.
Well, I also grapple with this a lot. In critical race theory, if you're familiar with it, it's called interest convergence. And here I'm a white female, and because of the nature of our mass incarceration system, many of the young men and women are people of color. And I'm always grappling with the issue of how can a white woman speak to these issues. It's not my specific lived experience, and whose voices are being heard. And that is really important to me, to make sure that people who have really know the experience and understand it and have lived it, that their voices are being heard and somebody else is not telling it for them and benefiting from that. So I grapple with that a lot. I talk about that a lot. I teach now a class called Race and Communication that Professor Wallace developed, and I'm teaching a second section of that this semester, actually. And it's really important to me and some of the students ask me at the beginning of the semester, or it's the elephant in the room, how can a white woman be teaching this class? And talk about white fragility, white privilege, white supremacy, all those issues too. So it's complicated. I don't know how I got to this place, but part of my writing is around race and racial issues too.
Well, I was going to say, maybe we should unpack it a little bit here on the show. Like, what do you say to them when they ask that question? And, why do you find yourself in this kind of work? How do we find ourselves in this kind of work?
How do you find? Yes, well, we talk about it, and I say, well, no, it's not my lived experience. However, as a white ally, I think it's actually white people's responsibility to talk about race and racial issues in this country. And in the past, made it the other person's problem. And that whites have to address the systemic issues around race and be comfortable doing that. And we haven't always been comfortable. hence the white fragility, the defensiveness, the not for everyone, but the uncomfortability of talking about race. And I think in this climate, in this political climate, I mean, it's pretty obvious that these are paramount issues. And I tell my students that if anyone needs to be talking about it and be comfortable and be a part of the solution, it's white people. So it's really my responsibility in many ways. With privilege comes responsibility.
Right. And besides the books, you did mention you've made documentaries, and you can,
Yeah.
So you want to talk about
And
why did you move into that vehicle as communication? Did you think?
well, it's a way to tell stories as well as writing, as a way to give voice. And so it was actually a component. There was the books, there was the documentary, there was the any way to have vehicles for people to grapple with issues around incarceration, around education, and around race. And so it was a vehicle, and I did it collaboratively with a group of students, and that's the whole thing about adult education. The idea, it's a collaborative effort between students and staff and professors, and that we can work at this together because everybody has something to bring to the table and their own expertise. If I've never been incarcerated, we're all well, that's another story. But if I've ever been incarcerated in a physical prison, I'm not an expert at that, and I need other people who have that lived experience. So that's part of the philosophy of adult education, and I think any good education is to hear and listen to and bring to the table different voices that have different life experiences.
Yep. Well, and I agree. I want to talk a little bit because you're also a member of CUNY's Prisons in the Schools Committee. Is that, have I got that correct? Emily Ty from
Yes.
Queenssborough is the chair, and I've had
Yes.
Dr. The Reverend Dr. Kimura on from John Jay, but you're also part of that committee. And so, how does that play out on a CUNY-wide setting when you work with those folks? What kind of work are you doing with the committee in that area?
Well, Emily is just amazing. She's so consistent and just has reached out to everybody at CUNY. There's a lot of work with just sharing information, sharing what people are doing so that we're all motivated in the same way. Also, any kind of bringing any activism or protests or anything that people need to disseminating that information so people can be a part. Everybody plays a different part, and everybody has a little corner of the world in which they operate. And for me, it's writing and teaching and the working with the students and that kind of thing. But other people play different roles in how they address the issues at CUNY and how they move us forward. And so Emily is kind of the tie that binds everybody and gives people a voice, and she's been really good with me in disseminating the documentaries and the writing and the journal and being there for that and connecting people, networking with people. And yeah, so we meet, now we've been meeting once every couple of months, but that's been going on for numbers of years.
And you talked about, and you touched on it for a second, maybe we could talk a little bit more about it. The program that we have and the relationship we have with the Queenssborough Correctional Facility, which is on the corner of Van Dam and 47th Avenue. I know it's Dr. Cheney's program, but you've worked with him, so you want to talk about that and some of the folks that are involved and the things that they're teaching and the experience that they're having working with the students.
Well, that's been going on for a couple of years. It's volunteers. We'd like to have it be credit bearing. There's a lot of research And actually, in a new book that I'll talk about later that we're writing, we talk about, we know that education is the key to lowering recidivism. That's proven. But at any rate, right now at Queenssborough, across the street from LaGuardia, we have a volunteer program where a few professors more go in, but obviously not now during the COVID, because there have been cases actually of COVID. I don't know if your audience knows also about Queenssborough. This is the last stage for everybody there. So they're in their last, let's say, 3, 4, 5 months of their sentence. Many of them after 25 years in prison. And I've actually stood outside the door at Queenssborough when people have left and met their families after 25 years. And they are finishing their sentence. So the issue with COVID there, and there have been instances, is that close down Queenssborough. People are in the last stages anyway. They're going home. They've served most of their time. And this has been, there's been numbers of protests there in the last month or so about just let people go, because it's a it's actually a more confined space than some of the prisons upstate. People are there in large dormitories on top of each other. So the chance for the virus to spread is really very serious. And so at any rate, they haven't closed it down, but that would be a logical place to have closed down. At any rate, we haven't been in since the virus. And but when we were in the fall, there were numbers of us from the philosophy department, mostly from humanities, teaching around, there's some social science classes. Actually, that was somebody from office was teaching there. Robert Jaffe, I think, was teaching a course. And then Robin Levinson was teaching drama. Shannon Proctor was teaching a philosophy class. Let's see who else we have had in there. Francine White, communications class.
Well, Francine is actually in talks right now with College Now about offering a College Now opportunity to those folks, which would be credit bearing. That would lead to, credits that they could use anywhere really, because it's college credit.
Well, exactly. And, the Pell Grant used to be in prisons all over the country. And once the Pell Grant was pulled during the Clinton administration, it really dismantled most of the college courses, or many of them, not all of them. Bard is still, there's a few still colleges still run, but overall many of the GED and college bearing classes were dismantled around the country. And that was a huge mistake. So now there is a move to reinstate the Pell Grant. That is actually an economically sound solution, and it's sound policy in terms of rehabilitation and reentry. And more work needs to be done in that area, because dismantling it really was devastating to prisons all over the country.
Yes, I'm actually in talks. I spoke to Emily about possibly having some of the folks from the committee on the show at some point to talk about COVID-19 in the prisons, because they are aware of it and concerned about it. And it didn't hit me until now that obviously the program is, stopped as a result of we're not even allowed on the college campus. I don't think we'd be anywhere allowed in the prison, whatever you want to call it, campus facility. So
this is an issue of social justice for sure.
How many of those students come to LaGuardia after getting a taste of LaGuardia faculty and the notion that college is still an option?
Well, I don't know how many, but I know there are a few we'd like to have more. We'd like to have more of a linkage. We had a research project that went on when I was president, and where there was a whole research and the whole idea of having a linkage between the two, and a facilitator, hiring someone. At that time, there was someone hired for a short period of time to link the students, link the people leaving Queenssborough with the college, which is really a no-brainer because it's across the street and they're meeting the faculty. And but the program didn't continue to grow, wasn't funded. But so I don't know how many, but I know there is great interest. And I know that most of the students that I have had in the writing group at Queenssborough have a high school diploma or a GED, and some of them have some credits in college already. So it's really a no-brainer in terms of the relationship going forward. And what we have now established after Queenssborough, numbers of the guys said, we want to continue this writing group when we come out. So now we have a group in the it's called the Restoration Group. It's at Restoration Plaza in Bed-Stuy, and numbers of the guys from Queenssborough, now they're online. They'll be online tonight. But when we were face to face, they have a writing group that was a continuation of the program that started with LaGuardia and with Queenssborough, and it's now in Bed-Stuy at the Restoration Plaza, and now online.
Yeah, well, I just would say a lot of the folks that I've met that you work with, I've always been impressed by them. And I think I've heard you many times, many of the folks that you work with that go and work there talk about the level of preparation of the students. It's like they feel like they're working with graduate students because they're so excited to be there and want to be a part of that process.
Maybe this is the time I can say this. Professor Cheney and I are finishing a book called Gift from the Dark, learning from the incarceration experience. And it is about that very thing you said. It is about the organic intellectuals that come out of prison, and the although it's a prison, you can't minimize that as a horrific, awful, terrible place that nobody should ever be. But yet and still, out of that place comes the most amazing gifts of writing and reading and, as I said, organic intellectualism, the amazing gift that the dark place of prison is. And that those of us who haven't been incarcerated physically, because perhaps we all have been incarcerated in one way or another, whether it's physical or not, what we can learn from the incarceration experience. So that we're working on, because there are some gems, diamonds in the rough.
So we're going to pivot because we're at the half-hour mark. You're watching LaGuardia Web Radio, WLGR. The show is What's Going On. I'm your host, Hugo Fernandez. My guest is Dr. Joni Schwartz, who teaches at LaGuardia in the Humanities Department in the Communication Studies area as a professor, but is here as, now she's going to put on her co-editor hat because we're going to be talking about Dialogues in Social Justice, a journal, an adult education journal. Did I get it right that time?
Yes, you did.
Out of University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And so let's talk about DSJ and opportunities with DSJ. Tell us a little bit.
Well, it's a new journal, relatively new journal. It started in 2016. We've published 5 volumes, and it intersects social justice, adult education, social justice and adult education. And let me just define adult education for you. When we say adult education, we mean it in the broadest sense. Some people think, adult education, that doesn't mean community college. That doesn't mean, no. Adult education is any place where adults are being taught. So there is adult education in the corporate setting. There's adult education, in trainings, business trainings. Um, and we're defining adults. When I used to work in community-based organizations, when we were funded, we would define anybody over 18 years old as an adult. And so when sometimes people pigeonhole adult education and think it's just GED, however important that is, or ESOL or adult literacy. It is all of that, yes, but it is much more. So wherever you have a setting where adults are being taught, that is adult education. And so I studied with people who were doing work in corporate America. But anyway, this journal deals with the intersection of adult education and social justice. So we have had issues such as white privilege and white supremacy in adult education, prison education, social protest and social media. And then we have two new issues that are coming up. And one is liberation theology and adult education and social justice. And the most recent one, the one that is really very, very current, is the coronavirus pandemic and adult education pedagogy, and how that intersects with issues of digital inequality. So we are always seeking people for the journal.
Yeah, and then for full disclosure, I am on the masthead as a photo editor, or so I have some relationship. But this is not one of these journals that has any requirement of payment or anything like that. It's you submit for free, and it's peer reviewed. I've read peer reviewed pieces. But we have taken advantage, and there are faculty who have published in the journal. Right off the top of my head, I'm thinking of Terry Gorjan, a professor in photography, who's also a co-photo editor. Priscilla Stadler.
Yes, she has. Mm-hmm. She did a photo essay. And this is something we don't want to forget. Because it's an online peer-reviewed journal, we need to do more art, photography, social, media, the written word, yes, but those mediums as well.
Yeah, I tried with my Joe Conzo, but we couldn't figure out how to put it together in a way, and I just gave up trying. Or we could have gotten that into it.
But we absolutely want that kind of thing. Also, I thought about Vanessa Bing, Jason Williams, Wendy Nicholson. They have all published as well out of LaGuardia.
So in this particular, and so now what we're talking about is there's a request for manuscripts, right? And like as you said before, the focus now is social justice and adult education around the COVID-19 issue, right?
Yes.
And what types of manuscripts are you looking for? Because I remember that there are different categories that people could submit to. You want to talk about that a minute?
Yes. We always look for research articles, but because this happened so suddenly, we suspect there'll be less people who have had time to do some real formal research. But we're always looking for research. We're looking for reflection essays, which are shorter essays, 1,200 to 1,300 words. And those can be more personal narratives of people's experience, grappling with the change in teaching and pedagogy, and andragogy being the teaching of adults, and the also issues of disparity and it's made it very clear. The virus itself has made it very clear because people of color have been disproportionately affected by the virus, but they've disproportionately been affected in terms of the access to technology and the resources. So those kinds of issues are certainly social justice issues, and the virus has just highlighted them. And so we're looking for that. Reflective essays, book reviews we always look for, but we think that probably with this issue, we're going to look more at maybe some reflective essays, photography, maybe some artwork, those kinds of things for this particular one, because we're planning on publishing this in the fall. This is the abstract. If you have an idea, we would like the abstract by June 10th, 15 or 50 word abstract with your idea. And our hope is to publish it for the fall.
Right. And I mean, one of the things I thought about, this didn't hit me until I saw Liz Iannotti on one of the links, which is we have a very large adult continuing education program. So when you say adult education, that's who I think of.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So obviously, if you define an adult as being 18 years old, then the majority of LaGuardia students are adults. And so one of the things came to mind is what is happening with those programs like CLIP and the particularly immersion programs, any program for folks who are they come to us, educational experience here in the United States. Many cases, they're probably struggling with the digital divide issues, access to the proper machines or access to the internet. And so how are those programs responding? Is that the kind of, because
Sure.
When I think about, as an educator, the response to COVID-19, mostly what I'm thinking about is the heavy lifting that folks have had to do to figure out how to engage through these machines and online using. Today we had the episode where Blackboard went down. We never found out why, but so people who were teaching courses, they, on top of everything else, they lost that tool. And our students, even our whatever you want to call them, not adult, but our college students, our undergrad students, are struggling with this online process. So I can only imagine for folks, particularly if they're disenfranchised economically or otherwise, that it's got to be tough to persist in this kind of work in this environment. So
Absolutely.
So I would think that people are responding to that.
I'm sure. When I look at the emails going back and forth about the issues around the stress and the mental health and the, being on our students being essential workers and having to do those jobs, there's so many issues that really speak to our journal and to the topic of the pandemic and adult ed and social justice, those three intersections. And also we're looking for articles and reflective that you could write with students, actually. Might be co-author something.
Well, this is something that you do, right? Where you mentor students in the writing process.
Write with them and publish with them. That's an idea. Also, photo essays. I know that for my nonverbal communication class, we have done photo essays through this process, documenting, through image, the virus and the progression of the virus and how we've changed and how our environment has changed nonverbally, because so much of what's happened has been nonverbal. And so I have a whole series of photographs that students have taken that document that. So that kind of work might also lend itself certainly to this issue. Be very creative. I don't think people should limit themselves to only the written word.
Right. Well, I'm thinking, because I found myself this semester teaching the capstone course for the fine art area. It's actually the first semester I've never taught beginning photo for whatever glitch my class didn't run. But I'm working with students who are gifted artists, and all of a sudden we weren't meeting face to face. I think I had one face to face. maybe 2 face-to-face meetings with them. I can't even remember at this point. And suddenly well, the way I typically handle that course is we put on an exhibition. I call it my little AFA, a little, what is it, Associate in Fine Arts. And where typically there's a kind of a thesis that I make them write. This year, I'm channeling a lot of that energy into producing quality e-portfolios. But we have an exhibition, and now we're actually doing it online. And in the first crit, I had one young woman who talked about lacking inspiration, and which is always an issue for artists. And I was kind of saying, like, that's not an option, for artists. That if you wait around for inspiration, as Picasso used to say, if inspiration arrived, she would find me working. That kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's you got to just keep at it. But over time, I came to understand, the kinds of family sickness, whatever was going on in her community. A lot of things have gotten in the way, and gratefully, the student is making work, and a lot of the other students have been making work. Half of them respond to it, half of them don't. But for me, it's been trying to figure out how do I, on top of dealing with the issues of students who sometimes struggle just doing the classwork, but now I'm dealing with students, artists making artwork, is on top of everything else, legitimate reasons for, and all reasons are legitimate, but what they're going through has just ratcheted up the level of the things that, I was on the, going back and forth with the wellness center, trying to offer counseling and things like that. And, it drives me crazy that I have to go through this machine to do it, that I can't necessarily walk a student to the wellness center, for example, which I've done historically in the past. I don't even get away with that. But by the way, I'm being told that Jamie Riccio has questions coming up for us. But some of the things you want to say about the request for proposals up to this time, and you're smiling. Is something going on in your apartment that is distracting you? Yes.
No, I'm fine.
All right. Well, we're about to open it up to questions. So
okay, good.
I don't know what you feel about any of those things that I just shared with you about what it's like.
Absolutely. So this journal is a vehicle for actually, faculty work with students to maybe even bring forth some of their work. We're really open. If to get to the journal, you go to Dialogues in Social Justice and Adult Education Journal, and the registration is free, and the submission guidelines are there. In terms of the COVID issue, June 10th, the abstract is due, just your idea. We'll
How many
approve
words?
it or not. And then you will submit the full submission later in the summer.
How many words in the abstract? Oh, I'm starting to get questions coming.
250 words for the abstract. Mm-hmm. But you'll see that all on the journal. Okay,
so at this point, we're actually going to, if I could figure out how to do this, open up. I can't get to my emails. Here's the digital divide. So here's our first question coming from the Twitch chat, Twitch section. When it comes to the coronavirus pandemic and this edition of DSJ for pedagogical issues and social justice during the crisis generally, what are some examples of work you've seen thus far? And is there any work being done that has particularly impressed you?
Yeah. Great question. Well, we haven't received any issues specifically for this one, but in our previous issue, we had a big turnout of white supremacy and white privilege articles, and those were tremendous. But in terms of the COVID one, in answer to this question, we're thinking in terms of the inequities, a lot about how, some individuals have access and our students in particular are disadvantaged because of, either they have to write their papers on a cell phone, or they don't have internet access, or they have they've experienced the virus in the family and had a lived experience of it, that it's affecting their education. So we just having, let me give you an example of one of my students. He just came from prison, and he's been just learning Zoom, Blackboard Collaborative for the first half of class. He didn't even appear because he said, I didn't have the right computer, then I didn't know how to do it. So he's on a huge high learning curve. So looking at some of those issues that are impacting our students, I think would be very, very interesting, but maybe also from a more systemic perspective also. I'm not sure that answered the question.
Yeah, I don't know. Hopefully we'll get some more. I'm thinking, it's interesting because just in the last few days, and I know this as a result of just being involved with the University Faculty Senate and things that come across my desk, but I believe the federal government has, at this point, or the Department of Education has already stated that online education is an option for the fall semester. That's now moving into the Middle States folks and their approval of it for the Mid-Atlantic area. Obviously, at this point, the New York State Education Department would have to make that determination. And then the governor and the chancellor, before we would figure out what the fall semester is going to look like. Obviously, summer is, at this point, fully online. And though some people try to deal with this by offering their courses as hybrids, and I have to always remind them, hybrid, by definition, has to be a third face-to-face. So, unless you plan to see them at the end of the semester, that's not going to save you.
Yeah.
But let's say we're looking at an online fall. Let's just say that's a hypothetical. What would be one way to, because I believe there's a lot of anxiety on the part of students to now walk into a semester signing up for these classes. It's going to affect enrollment. And how can we help mitigate those concerns, even though we share them? We have a lot of concerns. And one of the things I've come up with is maybe we have to ask our students who've been through this process now, because we all feel we've been through a semester of online education, right? So we kind of feel like we know what we're doing, but they've also been through it as well. And it may be an opportunity to basically say, hey, let's say you had to take this class again and it was online again. What worked? What didn't work?
Yeah.
And what would make it, because I know that all these tricks I came up with, for the face-to-face experience, they are hit and miss on the online experience. And some of them are even cumbersome, and I got to really look at letting them go. But I'm just and I thought to myself, okay, maybe I got to take this semester. Typically, this is something that comes out of SIRS, and you've been teaching for many years, but this is a very unusual situation. So
it's a high learning curve for all of us, isn't it? And as I think about, as you were talking, and I think about the last question, here's a couple of other issues. Ageism. How about the really older adult students and computer literacy access? How does this disadvantage them? And also going back to basic adult education, GED online, what's up with that now? I don't know if anybody's, how are people getting their GED? And I know we call it the task now, we don't call it the GED in New York, but adult literacy, those kinds of basic things. Then family literacy, students also having to deal with their children being online, right? And then doing their own college work and then trying to put food on the table. Those are all issues. So I think that there's multiple, and then I've had students who say, I really like this. I like to work individually. I don't like to be in groups. This really works for me. I intensely like to read, and this kind of platform really is ideal for me. So there may be some really great stories in that regard that people do better. I
Well,
don't know.
that's what people have said. The genie's out of the bottle, and that we can expect after all of this that there's going to be an online component to CUNY, greater than what we had before.
And then, talk about resilience, right? Some of this is just resilience. I watched some of the students, they get bumped off Blackboard and they don't know what they're doing. And then they're back on and then they pop up again but they stick with it. And then other students that don't have that, resilience. What was that, a habit? Wasn't that one of the habits of learning?
Well, I've heard a phrase called grit. Grit theory.
That's it. Grit theory.
Paul,
Yes.
Dr. Arcario did a sabbatical, and one of the things he was going to do is find out about grit, explore grit.
That's right. Well, you have to have grit for this. And I guess that's looking at the cup half full, because I know for me personally, I learned a lot about myself, about technology, about this has been a really, in that regard, very positive experience.
So, Dr. Schwartz, the hour is almost over. So I want to give you, I told you, I want to give you a little time to say some last things or anything that you feel like you'd like to say just before. I will say to folks, you did talk about going onto DSJ online, but you did send out an email college-wide.
I did.
And, if you'd like, I can tag it on to the next teaser I send out next Monday for the next show.
Yes, please.
But
yes.
Anything else you'd like to say with a couple of minutes left?
Well, I really encourage people to think about writing or photos or media to send to this issue. And also to think about co-writing something, producing something with students. Also, there's also another call for liberation theology, if any of you. That is a very fascinating topic in terms of adult education, especially in Latin America. And so we are looking for people who have any interest in the intersection of liberation theology and adult education and social justice. And not very much work has been done on that. So if people have an interest, there is an English professor at LaGuardia. I'm trying to think what his name is now. Let me see if I can find it.
It's hard to remember stuff, isn't it?
Wrote a book with about Frary and Leopoldo. Irvin Leopoldo wrote A Pedagogy of Faith, the theological vision of Paulo Freire. And he comes out of the English department at LaGuardia. And his book is the inspiration, actually, for this call for proposals. So please go to it. And even if you don't write something, register for the journal and support us. I think it's an important endeavor.
I believe so as well. And that's why I wanted you on. You've done great work. You are an inspirational personality, as far as I'm concerned, on the campus. And I want to just thank you for all the help you gave me in the time that we've been both working towards tenure in full. And I'm excited to have you on as part of the team.
Thank you, Hugo. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
And thanks for being on the show. And I think, so I'll say this, you've been watching What's Going On. I'm your host, Hugo Fernandez. My guest today was Dr. Joni Schwartz with the Humanities Department in the area of Communication Studies. And we've been talking about her work co-editing the Dialogues in Social Justice, an adult education journal out of University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And it's a great opportunity, particularly for folks who are working their way through tenure to publish and go through the process of peer review, the gold standard